Hey there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec, and today I want to talk with you about drawbacks. Tons of Magic cards have downsides that are so severe that you just don't want to go anywhere near them. A lot of ink has been spilled about cards like Sorrow's Path and One with Nothing, for instance. Try as you might, these cards are just not worth playing. And of course, there are cards with drawbacks that aren't really all that bad in the Commander format. Path and Swords, Nature's Claim, Reality Shift, Pongify and Rapid Hybridization, Anguished Unmaking, Beast Within, Generous Gift, Assassin's Trophy. These removal spells are some of the very most popular spells in the entire EDH format, because Commander players know that in this form of Magic the Gathering, those drawbacks don't outweigh the benefits of such efficient and versatile removal. And yes, plenty of those cards are good in formats beyond just Commander, and in fact have been doing so since before Commander was even around. Their downsides just feel lessened even more when we're in a format that has a higher starting life total and more starting players. The thing I want to focus on, though, are the times when cards have drawbacks that aren't just not all that bad, but in fact drawbacks that are actually good for you. They're super fun to play with, and even though they look bad at first, in truth, they can actually enhance your strategy. These are a few of my favorite examples. We all know how good sacrifice outlets are, right? Not when we first get into the game, perhaps. Losing a whole creature feels like a big deal initially. But it's a common saying in Magic these days that if a card just said sacrifice a creature, do nothing, it would still totally be playable. Taking free game actions at any time for no mana is quite good, it turns out. And even beyond the benefits of that sacrifice effect, doing things like sacrificing your commander in response to someone's Song of the Dryads, for instance, feels a whole lot better than losing access to it completely. Even a simple Oh Hi Market can be used to avoid your creature getting exiled by a removal spell and putting it instead into your graveyard, where you might be able to recur it with other cards. Or I've even seen someone cast a Plumb the Forbidden to save their army from being turned against them by someone else's mob rule. And you don't have to be in an Aristocrats deck to use these either. Plenty of Yuriko decks make use of spells like Abjure, for instance, which would put her right back into the command zone. And frankly, that's kind of where she wants to be, because it's harder for her to land a hit when she's already in play, and it's much easier for her to land a hit when she can, from the zone, Commander Ninjutsu off the back of a 100% unblockable creature. Casting a Momentous Fall can feel really good in response to a board wipe, since you'd be losing your stuff anyway, but it feels even better in response to other people's combat tricks, like a Deflecting Palm. And of course, we don't just love using creatures as a resource, your own life total is totally a resource too. I could go on and on and on about tons of different Necropotent style effects, of course, but to highlight one key example, one of the things I miss most about my old Greven deck was using stuff like Treasonous Ogre. Not only did it turn life into a resource, but it also turned that downside of paying life into a power-up for my commander, and new legends like Rowan Scion of War make use of that sort of effect as well. As long as I'm here talking about red cards, cards like Tormenting Voice don't give true card advantage because they technically break even on the number of cards that you'll wind up with in your hand, but that cost, discarding a card to cast them, is a cost that red decks were very excited to pay. Duretti tossing some huge artifact into the graveyard to more easily scrap it back into play, or tossing like an Anger into the graveyard to give the entire team haste, that's excellent. This is why I'm really excited to get a couple copies of that new Triumph card too. I'll happily destroy something by tossing a huge creature into the graveyard that I fully plan to reanimate later. Speaking of reanimating, Makeshift Mannequin is high-key one of my favorite resurrection spells. It's instant speed reanimation, which is really cool, but it does say that if the creature gets targeted, it has to be sacrificed. That seems bad at first, but what that actually means is that if it does get targeted, it will go right back into the graveyard, instead of getting exiled by some rogue Swords to Plowshares or something, so I can still get it back again later. That's actually perfect. In fact, it's the reason why cards like Phantasmal Image are so enjoyable, right? Usually in the Commander format, if your thing is getting targeted, it's probably being targeted by a removal spell, so this downside isn't really a downside. And even if you're sad to see it go, it's going right back to a place where any number of cards can fetch it back for you in all kinds of strategies. Related to all of that discard graveyard nonsense, this is also why I love bounce lands so much. I've had people tell me that these are unplayable. I'm not kidding, because if you play them on turn 2, you'd have 8 cards in your hand and then you'd have to discard a card to hand size. I use these regularly to discard huge creatures into my graveyard for later resurrection. And also, landfall players laugh at the idea that these are, quote, unplayable. I mean, have you seen an AC player bounce the same land over and over again? It's ridiculous. My love of bounce lands extends also to the colorless one, Guildless Commons, which I only use in monocolor and two-color decks, but which I love a whole lot. Frankly, there's yet another aspect to these cards that you can investigate too. Savvy players use these kinds of cards to reduce their land count without losing out on mana resources, so that they can more regularly trigger cards like land tax, for instance. It's no mistake that when you look on the EDH rec page for Lotus Field, which forces you to sacrifice lands, you can see that in addition to being in a whole bunch of landfall decks, it also often shows up in decks containing cards like Knight of the White Orchid and Weathered Wayfarer. The cost that you pay for these types of lands isn't actually a cost. It's actually setting up your other cards to be more reliable. Speaking of white cards, I know lots of players don't like Cut a Deal all that much because it lets your opponents draw stuff, but I do personally like the card, and I like it even more when the person who's casting it has a Smothering Tithe in play to take advantage of the opponent's drawing cards. Well, okay, I don't like being on the receiving end of that interaction, but you know what I mean. In fact, Wheels decks are just a huge example of this whole phenomenon, right? Letting opponents draw more cards or refilling their hand can absolutely be used poorly and totally hand the game to one of those opponents. But if used responsibly, Wheels players with stuff like Smothering Tithe or other such payoffs obviously turn that huge risk into huge reward, getting lots of benefits off of the draw or discard effects like pings and token creation, or having things like the new Heliod giving you a discount of like 30 plus mana on any given turn. Beyond just card draw, there are plenty of times where players will give things to their opponents for the express purpose of turning it against them. A Forbidden Orchard that gave you extra bodies will later potentially be punished by either stealing those bodies back or making those bodies a source of damage. Rites of Flourishing can give away all of those extra resources, only for a card like Treacherous Terrain to come around and punish you for all of those resources. And who could forget the commanders like Beamtown and Zedru, which give away cards with heinous drawbacks to make sure that opponents suffer instead of them. I could probably go on with tons of other examples, like almost anything in an Obeka deck, for example, or heck, the entire dredge mechanic. Like skipping your draw for the turn and milling some cards was supposed to be a downside, and it turns out the higher the dredge number, the more busted that card is likely to be. There's a ton of other examples, but I was just trying to stick to some of my favorites. But the real reason I wanted to mention those times where downsides can actually be upsides isn't just because they're fun, but it's actually because I think that having that frame of reference is useful to help us contrast against the times when things that look like upsides can actually be downsides. I know, plot twist, woo! Just as much as there are cards that look quite bad but can actually be quite good, there are lots of cards that look quite good but are actually quite bad. It's just that their drawbacks aren't as readily evident. For instance, I get asked a lot why I don't play some cards like Gisa and Geralf or Geralf Visionary Stitcher in my zombie deck. They look like they'd be great for zombies, right? Well, not so much when I cast my Zombie Apocalypse, which destroys all humans, or when I cast a Kindred spell or a Raise the Palisade. Those non-zombies would get swept up in it too, so I want to limit the number of off-type creatures that I have in that deck as much as I reasonably can. Or, speaking of humans, one of my friends in my regular playgroup has a Kyler Humans deck, and when the new Carvanista card came out, I wondered if she'd want to play it, but it's not going in her Kyler deck. As nice as this card looks, buffing humans is not something that Kyler needs a lot of extra help with. In fact, one of the things it needs the most help with is making sure that its army can be saved at instant speed. But especially the reason it's not going in that deck is because the opportunity cost of playing a non-human in that card slot decreases the efficacy of other cards in the deck like Horn of Gondor, or reduces the amount of life that could be gained whenever she casts a Heron's Grace champion. And opportunity cost, that's a huge part of this discussion. I've been very harsh on cards like Helm of the Gods in the past. Ostensibly, this card wants to go into an enchantments deck, but as Enchantress players know, casting a non-enchantment card has tons of ripple effects on the strategy. For example, it will fail to draw you a lot of cards off of your many enchantresses. It won't trigger constellation effects. It doesn't tick up your cards that care about your enchantment count. And it turns out that intricate web of triggers is way more important to your success in a game. Plus, nowadays there are actual enchantments that have this effect anyway. Helm of the Gods poses as a great card for enchantresses, but it turns out to be more of a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's a huge opportunity cost, and if you used another enchantment card in that card slot instead, you'd have many more branching successful results. Kind of related to opportunity cost, we've probably all had a situation where we ran too many utility lands, right? And then suddenly in a game, we don't have access to the colors we need. Turns out we gotta scale back because the cost of playing too many of those lands is very real. With any individual one of these, it might not feel like a big cost to pay, but taken as a whole, the density of them can be a real doozy. There's also the way that certain cards can shape the tide of battle sort of above board. Anyone who's cast a Bloodchief Ascension or an Exquisite Blood knows that suddenly all of the attack steps will get pointed right in your direction. These cards basically have invisible text that says people want to hit you now, because if they hit someone else, they'd be giving you free stuff. And opponents probably don't want to give you free stuff. These cards are fantastic, obviously, but they and many more cards like them draw attention to themselves and to their controllers in a way that is hard to fend off. So if you are going to cast them, you have to be prepared for the heat. Potentially, you could say that the hidden downside of these cards is that they're completely transparent. They loudly broadcast your strategy. Frankly, cards that don't affect the board state right away are another big cost unto themselves. How many times have we lamented on this channel that we love Grave Betrayal, but taking a whole turn off to cast it feels really hard to justify when it means that we would leave ourselves shields down in the late game. And there are things like timing restrictions to be aware of too. I mentioned this in a recent video, so I apologize for using the same example again, but I don't play cards like Silver Smoke Ghoul in my Baba Saga deck because it only triggers on your own end step. If I were to play that card in my deck, it would basically force my hand a little bit, and encourage me to activate my commander on my own turn more often. But there are a lot of reasons in that deck that I prefer to activate her at instant speed. If a card encourages you to shift your tempo or play pattern in a way that feels less advantageous, that's yet another secret downside. Or I used Obeka as an offhand example earlier, and she can end the turn to avoid horrible downsides of cards. But how many of the cards that you put into your Obeka deck basically require her to be in play for you to cast them at all? The true downside of cards like these isn't the negative text on the card itself, but the way that it forces the entire deck to suddenly become hyper-commander-centric, only able to cast spells if the commander is alive and healthy. So all an opponent has to do is pick off the commander, and then the entire thing goes kaput. When you're brewing, you've got to pay careful attention to that sort of thing. A high density of commander-reliant cards will also affect how you're able to play that deck. And maybe that's a cost you're happy to pay, but it's important to know that it is, in fact, a cost you're paying. And to throw in just one more potentially contentious example, cards with deceptive flexibility are worth a mention. My podcast co-host has mentioned before that he doesn't play the card Disallow anymore because he noticed that 99% of the time when he cast it, it was only ever to counter a spell. He never countered triggered abilities with it. So even though it was nice to have that option on that spell, if he never actually uses that other option, then he's just paying more mana for a regular counterspell effect. And maybe he could find a more mana efficient version of that effect to use in that card slot instead. If you personally do use those other modes regularly, then those flexible cards can be aces. But ultimately, paying extra mana for flexibility that you never use would indeed be another potential and not immediately evident drawback to a card that at first seems to promise only upside. There are tons of possible examples of these, and frankly, I'd love to hear more from you. Which cards have you encountered that appear to have a bunch of downsides, but actually can be turned into a neat upside? Which cards present as though they're all upside, only to later reveal that they actually have a ton of hidden drawbacks? Staying more vigilant about finding those non-obvious disadvantages, or finding ways to turn something bad to your advantage, can help you be more flexible and creative as a brewer and as a player. So share your thoughts below. Note that liking and subscribing is all upside, and thanks so much for watching. And as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.